Did you know that Active Directory is exploited in 9 out of 10 cyber attacks? With access to Active Directory, attackers can gain control of your network. To keep attackers out, you need to find and fix Active Directory security gaps. Meet Purple Knight, a free security assessment tool that scans your environment for hundreds of vulnerabilities and helps you fix the problems. Ready to reduce your Active Directory attack surface? Download Purple Knight, the #1 Active Directory security vulnerability assessment tool. Visit securityweekly.com/Sempiris. Why is identity resilience a top priority for security executives? Because your identity access management or IAM system is critical to your business. Whether you use Okta, Microsoft Entra, or another IDP, if your IAM is attacked, your operations can go down for hours or days, directly impacting your bottom line. So what's your backup plan? Mighty ID is here to save the day, reinforcing your IAM resilience. With flexible backup and recovery, and even migration between IDPs, Mighty ID keeps business running when failure is not an option. Check out Mighty ID at securityweekly.com/Mighty ID for more. Panoptica, Cisco's cloud application security solution, provides end-to-end lifecycle protection for cloud-native application environments. It empowers organizations to safeguard their APIs, serverless functions, containers, and Kubernetes environments. Panoptica ensures comprehensive cloud security, compliance, and monitoring at scale, offering deep visibility, contextual risk assessments, and actionable remediation insights for all your cloud assets. Get more information at securityweekly.com/Panoptica. Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Ben Carr. On the evening of Monday, May 6, 2024, W2 Communications and Cyber Risk Alliance are bringing Cyber Tacos back to San Francisco. If eating free tacos, sipping on margaritas, and mingling with cyber professionals from all over the world sounds good to you, make sure to visit and secure your spot by visiting securityweekly.com/cyber tacos today. Security Weekly listeners, join the digital identity community at the Aria Resort and Casino in Las Vegas, May 28th to the 31st. The 15th annual Identiverse will bring together over 3,000 security professionals for 4 days of world-class learning, engagement, and entertainment. As a community member, receive 25% off your Identiverse 2024 tickets using code IDV24-SW25. Register today by visiting securityweekly.com/IDV 2024. All right, Ben, let's get into some articles this week.
Let's dig in.
Yeah, let's dig in. So first up, generative AI governance for the board, I guess is the best way to put it. It's what are the things that the board should be asking, probably aren't asking about generative AI?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. I think it's what are we all trying to ask about AI, right? Lines of the business have to think about themselves. The board should be thinking about what are the implications from not only a privacy side, but I think intellectual property, right? And how does that impact, generative AI? The biggest concerns for me are, the data that's shared with the model, where the model's stored, who has access to the model, and how's that data further extended out into the ecosystem. And so for me, there's a lot of concerns around compliance, legality, and what the potential long-term impact is for the company. I just don't know that the board has enough. Look, I think we're struggling with having cyber representation on the board, right? So now it's AI representation. Like, how's that going to work?
Right. So we've covered some articles where organizations have kind of like stopped a bunch of their AI projects, right? And I think part of it is like, what's the implications of generative AI, right? And this article attempts to lay out some of those questions that the board should be asking and maybe some guidance on these. But to your point, Ben, it kind of goes back to the same thing with cyber risks, right? Like the board hasn't fully addressed that. This is a variation of that. There's obviously security and privacy concerns with the data, the intellectual property side. Like, what are these models doing with the data? Is it getting exposed? Like, there's so many questions here. I don't know that one article or one guidance here is going to help these boards. But I did think it was interesting to kind of read through some of these questions because I'm like, well, I could almost ask the same thing about cyber risks.
Yeah, pretty much. I also think who owns the risk here, right? Is it cyber? Is it a combination of both? I read another article, I think it was last week, talking about the emergence of the chief AI officer, right? Like, is that going to be a new thing? And like, I just don't, I don't really think you can keep extending it. So, we talk about it all the time with Jason. Is this concept of a chief risk officer, right? And it's really risks, right? Because there's
Hmm.
legal things, there's risks, right? And those are the two, I think, main concerns for me outside of the pure business impacts of leveraging AI.
Yeah, so this gets really interesting as I've been talking to clients, right? And I find this chief risk officer like role still like not in most organizations. Like it's funny, I'll talk to clients who are like, "Yeah, so we're doing cyber risk quantification." And I have to roll those results to my enterprise risk management
Yeah.
group and my operational risk management group. So risk is being managed by like three different teams.
Yeah, well, it's really different. Right? Well, it's the same, but it's really different, right? Like, the concept of how to deal with it in the quantification, I think, is very similar concept across, right? But the technical risks from a cyber side are somewhat different from the operational
Hmm.
risks that somebody's looking at, right, when they're running a business. And so I think it's not generally the same person that's going to be able to oversee them and understand them unless again, you're talking a very large organization where they've got the tolerance, and then there's someone down level from that risk officer who understands the specific areas of risk, right? It's again kind of that chicken and egg thing we talked about in the earlier segment. At what point are you large enough to invest in everything you need to get it done? It's a challenge.
Yeah. And I just find it interesting that somebody does enterprise risk to me means all risks,
It does,
operational,
yeah. It
cyber,
should.
generative. It should, right? But yet I'm not seeing some of those constructs still. I mean, I think the banks and some of the financials, maybe some of the insurers, but when you get outside of those more mature
Yeah.
industries, we're not seeing this consolidation of enterprise risk this way yet.
Yeah, it's very very large organizations, very very mature organizations are thinking about it that way, and you'd be surprised the organizations you get down at just one notch below that, and yeah, it's a very dispersed. I mean, as the CISO, you're trying to bring it together, right? You're trying to
Mhm.
explain that this still has impacts of the overall risk environment, right? And it's not a technical issue; it's a risk issue.
Right. Yes. And just don't present another risk score, please. All right, article number 2. SEC charges disrupt role of the CISO. We've covered the SolarWinds thing for a long time. There's one great question in here. Could the SEC ruling become the catalyst for CISOs leaving organizations? And I think, yeah, probably could be.
Well, look at around that same question. Like, it says, it's a very tumultuous position to sustain and fill. Current employment market is difficult to find the right talent. Like, I'm not sure if that aligns with what I'm seeing in the market, right? Like, there's not a lot of CISOs moving around right now. There's not a lot of churn. Um, I do think it's going to hopefully get rid of people who aren't serious about the job, right? I think
Mm,
there's a lot of CISO name onlys out there. I think that you're going to come under scrutiny. So that's one positive change I think we'll see out of this. I'm hoping in the long run. They also talk about like they're scared about how much money they're going to have to pay for CISOs and what they're going to need as far as retention and acquisition. And yeah, you should be. Like, you
mhm.
should be thinking about all these things. Like, CISO is a real C-level position if done correctly and implemented correctly, and it brings great value to the org. So I think people need to be serious about the role, and companies need to be serious about hiring for the role.
Yes. And speaking about serious about hiring for the role, this next article talks about Google's office of the CISO. So it's not a single CISO, it's a group of CISOs. Obviously, one of the most notable, Phil Venables, who was over at Goldman Sachs. I mean, I remember working with Phil's team years ago when I was at Archer, and I think they ended up
Yeah.
just building something. But I mean, you see what Google's been doing. This article goes into kind of what the plans for that office of the CISO looks like, and kind of builds this blueprint around how do you bring in CISOs from different organizations to help people really kind of understand the risks associated with security. It's a really interesting approach and article.
Yeah, the difference here with the Office of the CISO, because I've seen Office of the CISO at other, again, large organizations, right, where they've got a large staff that they're trying to manage. Here, it's a bit different, right? It's aligned with their customer base, and so
Hmm.
that makes total sense to me. If Google's trying to target customers in the healthcare sector, they have specific needs that aren't the same necessarily as financials,
Hmm.
and so it makes a lot of sense to figure out how to have a targeted message, have a good understanding of what customers want, and hopefully tailor solutions to those markets so they align with the needs. Again, prior segment, right? Like it doesn't really matter whether it's a small or a large company. Make sure you're focused on the delivery and what the actual product needs are versus just delivering something that you think is the best fit. And I think this is a really smart way to do it, right? Focus on that.
Yeah, I guess this office then becomes kind of a driver to the way Google changes their product to address these concerns across all these different industries. So my guess is one, it's a very client facing, customer facing role,
Yep.
but they're also probably a main key kind of input into future development projects, which is interesting, right? We were talking about this on the last segment, like when do you bring in, security staff, et cetera. But if you've got a vendor like this that has some of that expertise that's also building some of this into the product, depending on which product sets you're embedding in your product, you get some of those benefits too.
Yeah, optimally, it's bidirectional, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's where I've been trying to focus on talking to companies and other CISOs colleagues and say, look, there's an opportunity here for CISOs to really participate more in the business, right?
Hmm.
And to take that input. Where every, do you work for a vendor company? I think we think about that as CISOs as do you work for a security vendor? But the reality is every company is a vendor to somebody,
Hmm.
right? So can you connect with the customers? Can you understand what their needs are from a security side? And how can you bring that back to the organization then to enrich the product and make it more sticky, more effective, more valuable, right? Increase the value quotient to the customer.
Yeah. Yes. Um, and it also helps you, to me, just kind of make sure your solutions are relevant to those audiences as
Relevant.
well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a part one. I'm interested to see what part two looks like, on the trajectory of the CISO. And it's interesting. They've analyzed a bunch of data and they look at where CISOs, what their previous roles were before they became CISO. They go back one and two layers, right? And so they've got 44 CISOs on the right, and it maps through these different N minus one, N minus two jobs, right? And it's just fascinating to me, right? So they start with 44 CISOs. One comes from cloud security. 15 come from cyber defense operations, 12 come from governance, risk, and compliance, right? That's 28 of the 44 CISOs. What this doesn't do is identify where those other 18 or whatever the number is, 16 CISOs came from, right? My guess is maybe from the business or maybe from other industries, but not in one of these buckets, which I find a little fascinating. I'd love to find more of that data. But then when you go back one more level, governance, risk, and compliance is 10. So you go from 12 to 10. Cyber defense goes from 15 to 8. And so it's just interesting to me that the career path for people sitting in a GRC role to CISO is one of the most attainable, depending on where you want to go in your career trajectory.
Yeah, so I looked at the map in a little bit different way. One is I'm interested what a larger sample size would be,
Right.
obviously, than 100, Fortune 100. Um, I would like to look at also different size organizations, right, to see how it maps out differently. And I think that would be indicative of what people's potential board's interests are and where they see the concerns. The other thing is man, I from an N2 to N-1 to N-2, I'd really be interested in to see the third and the fourth level as well. I would wonder if it would bring out the fact that and then look at success rates on CISOs where there's a large number of cross training across disciplines in security. Like if somebody has cyber defense operations and risk and compliance, were they also in disaster
Mm.
recovery prior to that? Like does that trend lead off? And then the one thing I found like really odd was one from sales, like n minus two, one from sales. Like really, like how did that? I would like to understand what that direction to how that direction manifested itself and took,
Yeah.
right. There are a couple others, product security I kind of get, business resiliency I get, and then there's some people, I mean, military, law enforcement, software development, it was a fast path, and I would almost think about more potential physical security at that, maybe more of a CSO than CISO.
Yeah.
But
Or
yeah,
CTO.
it's a really interesting. Yeah, yeah, exactly. More interesting to look at this in some more depth, and I think I'd love to see how this fleshes out longer term.
Yeah, so I did find the deeper in the article, it does lay out the other 16, which doesn't surprise me. IT leadership's on that list, product security's on that list. But yeah, there are some interesting ones like public policy
Yeah,
and consulting. I mean,
consulting. Yeah,
obviously,
kind of makes
yeah.
sense. Yeah.
But a consultant through a consultant, well, what kind of consulting were you doing, right? It would have to be related in the field somewhere.
Hmm.
Yeah. Now, so I want to see part two because I'm curious what part two is. So hopefully next week or the week after, part two will be out and we can look at the next set of data. But I was just a little intrigued how some of this data mapped out. All right, next article up. Six common leadership styles, and how to determine which and when to use each of those. Now we've covered the leadership styles before in multiple segments somewhere along the way, but let me kind of just rehash them out quickly for people who haven't listened to them before. So the first one is a coercive leadership style, authoritative leadership style. I know a few of those. Pace setting leadership style, affiliate leadership, democratic leadership, and then a coaching leadership style. Some would say empathetic leader qualities in there. So H Harvard Business Review lays these out, and then it talks about these different styles in the when and how to use them, which was a little interesting, right? Because I think about like authoritative leadership styles, right? Um, and it says this leadership style is beneficial in lots of situations, particularly useful during times of change or uncertainty. Well, we're kind of in that kind of realm, or we were in that realm, with COVID and some of the aftermath to that. I'm not sure I would enjoy working in an authoritative leadership style personally, but seems to be pretty well adapted to that.
Yeah, I think it's all situational and depends upon how what you need to bring as far as the talents to that specific interaction, right? To be successful in. I think the biggest thing is, can you pivot and can you understand what you're trying to and who you're trying to engage with and understand how to bring the right talents to that mix. That's
Right.
that's the biggest thing.
Yeah. And I think it's someone who's been in multiple leadership roles. Sometimes you switch back and forth at any given time, right? Like there's certain styles. Like I don't want to be a micromanager, but there's times when you kind of have to be, right? You know what I mean? And so you're actually switching at certain times or at certain places during that leadership journey, right? You're like, wait, in this area, I have to be more authoritarian in in what I do versus some of the other. And so it's sometimes hard for leaders to kind of mix and match those under the right circumstances.
Yeah, if it goes against your style, it can be really hard
Yes.
to do. Yeah, but that
Yeah.
and I think that's the biggest growth path for leaders is to try to figure that out.
Yes. Uh, is that it? One, two, three,
I think
four,
you had
five.
communication gap
Oh no,
between
I got a
C-suite and
communication
yeah.
one in here. Yes. Actually, I think it my article jumped on me. Oh no, yeah, here it is. So last article: communication gap between C-suite and cybersecurity leaders. Yes, there is a communication gap. It wasn't a question; it was, I guess, a statement. But yes, there is one.
It's a fact, right? Yeah. Look, in here that some of this that larger budget, right? Heightened media scrutiny over cybersecurity and data privacy preparedness. I mean, yes, that's. I mean, everybody should be expecting that, right? So how do you effectively communicate what the program's doing? I mean, man, there couldn't be anything that's more important to a CISO. But yeah, bridging that gap, I think, can be very, very hard.
It's still very, very hard, right? I mean, even we were talking about this a little bit in the last segment, right? How CEOs have to be effective in a startup of understanding the problem they're solving, how to solve it, how to drive value. The You can have the same conversation about a CISO or about other C-level executives when it comes to cybersecurity. Like, how do you put it into a context that people understand, right? And that's been one of our biggest challenges, I think, in the space, Ben, is how do we communicate cyber risks and security concerns into something that business executives understand? And until we get there consistently, I don't see this going away.
No, and look, at the end of the day, for me, it's got to come back to the relationships you build, right? But I think part of that challenge is how do you foster that right relationship? How do you set the right groundwork
Mhm.
at the beginning of it so you can have those communications, right? Because by definition, like communication is going to be hard sometimes. If you're always having pleasant conversation, it's probably not a very fruitful relationship, right? Um, it's a really hard thing for a CISO coming into a role, trying to figure out how to navigate that, especially when there's probably an established relationships already exist, right, with those
Mhm.
other C-level execs. You're trying to figure out how to position yourself to add value, um, but still maintain a level of ownership over the risks, right? So you're not getting walked on. It's a very, very challenging area, right? Fraught with a lot of concern.
Yeah, I mean, Jason used to talk about it, right? When he'd walk in, go meet with the CFO. How does the CFO see cyber risks and how do they want to measure it, right? We talked about some of the challenges in larger orgs where risk is kind of divided between cyber risk that the CISO might own, but then you have operational and enterprise risk in those environments. Like, how do you get all those people on the same page? Like, that just adds to the gaps in the communication structure when you have to now figure out how to report risks across, maybe three different teams before they even go to the executive staff.
Yeah, and you know, look, CISO is a hard position, right? Because a lot of those relationships are kind of colored by the fact that you're going to be calling out deficiencies in those areas
Mhm.
sometimes. Like that's the definition of the role, right? Whereas, sales trying to bring in revenue, trying to raise profit, right? Trying to figure out how to move the company forward. And so, when you go talk to the CRO and you talk, about revenue and how you can, what you need to do, he's going to be very sensitive to like what you're going to get in the way of, right?
Uh-huh.
Same thing with legal, same thing with HR. And so there's that layer on top of it that it's just yeah, again, it's a very confusing dynamic to try to navigate and figure out how to best approach that and have those conversations. So, if, look, if I tell anything to anybody who's trying to be a CISO, you have to figure out how to improve your communication skills and be able to dialogue with people and have those relationships. That's the most important skill to bring to the table.
Yeah. And align on a set of objectives that you can rally around, right?
Yeah.
So I'm doing a side project, man, on this. I'm doing objective key result mapping
Oh yeah.
into risks, right? Because one of the things we're trying to figure out is if you have an objective around this, how does risk play or not play into that? Because as we continue to expand on the risk management side of communications, it's aligning them back to other company objectives that you can align to. So if that objective isn't in your environment or you don't have that objective, it doesn't mean you can ignore the risk, but it just helps you start to prioritize which risks are going to be important for you to meet those objectives that the business is trying to face. So I've actually done a ton of research on this. I'm trying to map it all out now. But it again, if you can align around those, now you have something common to communicate around, and then you figure out which metrics tie into those objectives because now everybody in the business understands that, oh, because we have this objective of growing revenue, here are the potential risks that might slow us down. So we have to understand them.
Yeah, that's a super interesting topic. We could probably talk for a long time about that, about OKRs and what they do to actually the success of a program. Because the wrong OKRs completely
Mhm.
disincentivize anybody from doing anything related to positive security hygiene,
I
right? And
know.
the easiest thing to think about is vulnerability management. Like for the longest time, hey, I need you to fix vulnerabilities. Yeah, but I'm in operations and my whole uh, objective is based upon availability and uptime. Anything I do for you is going to impact that in a negative fashion and reduce my OKRs. Like that's a factor where you need to think about the tone at the top, how it rolls out, and how
Mhm.
those objectives actually map to what you're trying to achieve as a company and how you communicate that out so the right objectives drive the right behavior.
Right. The fun challenge. I'll tell you, it's only taken us 20
Small
years
things to fix,
plus
just small
to
things.
get here. We'll just keep working on it, Ben. Thank you, Ben, for sitting in today and joining me. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.